everyone that did NFTs in 2021 and 22 is jumping in, trying to do BRC20s, and they're spending venture money, not their money, or they're spending like their ill-gotten crypto gains trying to do another pump and dump. And, as soon as they are not profitable and there's no more suckers at the table, they'll move on to the next grift. Like, it's all good for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is anti-fragile, and the more you kind of hammer at it, the more strong it gets. And so I just don't really mind the agitation.
So I do want to talk about something that is kind of talk of the town in Bitcoin world these days, which is the debate in Bitcoin about the use of the blockchain for inscriptions. Some people are calling inscriptions spam. Some are saying that the Bitcoin blockchain is uncensorable, therefore any activity is legitimate. What's your take on this?
Why not both? Like, there's always been spam, and it's also a legitimate transaction.
So to explain your position, yours is not the typical position.
I think it's much more typical than you would think. I think it's actually the mode. I would say it's probably the majority position is like, like we look at things like, I was just looking at, I think it was in 2021 or even early 2022, monthly revenue at OpenSea was like $400 million a month. And last month it was 1.7.
I mean, some of that is like they've lost their dominance. It's that one platform has.
Fair enough, but I think these themes come and go though, and I think most of this is just pump and dump hype.
So you expect this craze around inscriptions and ordinals to fizzle out? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it'll just right size. It'll be it's just all these people jumping in with their hype projects, trying to not dissimilar from all the money you're going to see spent by 12 to 15 ETF competitors. And there's going to, a few years later, there's only going to be one or two actually spending the ad money because everybody else kind of died out and is small. Similarly, everyone that did NFTs in 2021 and 22 is jumping in, trying to do BRC20s, and they're spending venture money, not their money, or they're spending like their ill-gotten crypto gains trying to do another pump and dump. And, as soon as they are not profitable and there's no more suckers at the table, they'll move on to the next grift. So that's basically what's going to happen. And I'll tell you what's definitely not going to happen is any of these promises about ordinals somehow bringing about the promise of the same type of promises that blockchain promised in 2015-16, that NFTs promised in 2021, literally taking all of the same documents in the same DEX and just finding search replace, replacing blockchain with NFT. They're doing it with ordinals now and saying that somehow this is going to put records on the blockchain and all this crap. Like, of course not. It's so stupid to use horizontal storage and store documents on everybody's node. It's idiotic. And so what you'll see is rational heads prevail, and they won't try to do that. And that was ludicrous to begin with. And you'll basically see things that actually do scale, like open timestamps, and basically keeping the documents offline, but at least being able to prove that they weren't altered since the time of the timestamp. That's how you actually do this sort of thing. And you don't need tokens, and you don't need ordinals, NFTs, or blockchains, other than Bitcoin.
Would you say that the workaround to enable inscriptions is an exploit, and that it's something that should be, patched?
No, but again, Bitcoin changes sometimes, and sometimes, what I think should be done isn't what ends up happening, and that's okay. And I don't understand it as deeply as the people that really, really care about this thing. I would say it's an open market. I think a lot of people don't understand that miners get to decide which block templates they put out, and that is an open market, and it's free for them to decide what they want to include in their blocks. So the block production is something that is that they can decide how they want to do it. And again, this is over my pay grade, but I'm just kind of parroting what I've seen folks that I've looked to for signal over the years, types of arguments that they're making. But at the end of the day, this was something that was enabled or made way easier. I mean, 2 orders of magnitude easier. Being able to get more than 80 bytes into the code was made possible by Taproot. It was not foreseen. It was not intended. It was something that people who were behind Taproot did not realize that this would be able to be done. It was a discovery that Casey made. Again, I just kind of take like the agitation and the conversations and the interest and the attempts to further it and to thwart it and to rationalize it and to, I mean, you see it's all good for Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is anti-fragile, and the more you kind of hammer at it, the more strong it gets. And so I just don't really mind the agitation. I can say I don't like scams that get described in the press that also have the word Bitcoin in them, which is what usually draws my attention. It's why I went hard at Do Kwon, Mashinsky, and SBF last year. So I don't like the scammy stuff, but it's not all scams either. Like digital art is a thing. I've believed that since the beginning, and I totally understand the urge to say that you own a piece of digital art. It's the extra promises and marketing claims and the moon boys that make 99.9% of it super scammy, but the category itself, innocently presented and accurately presented, like, yeah, that's a thing. It is. I get it.
Well, one other thing that I want to ask about was, as I'm sure you're aware, before Ordinals came on the scene, some people in Bitcoin were concerned about the security of the Bitcoin blockchain, because if activity was going to move to layer 2 and fees kind of remained where they were, and the block reward, would decrease as it's programmed to do, if the price didn't increase quickly enough, then the fiat value that miners would earn would drop significantly, and that could put the security of the Bitcoin blockchain at risk. So did you share that concern at that time? And then
not at all. That's basically altcoin miners pumping that narrative, trying to do altcoin things on Bitcoin. So that's not a true narrative. That's not actually how Bitcoin's network security actually functions.
Oh, so explain your perception of that.
It's probabilistic. It's probabilistic, right? So if you have a lot of certainty that there's not going to be a 51% attack over the next 3 blocks, then that's transaction finality probabilistically for you. And that's good enough for, a $10,000 purchase or something. If you're going to pay $500 million for something, you may not want to actually give over the good or the service finally until you have that in escrow, for instance, and you actually see that thing maybe 10 blocks deep or maybe even, 30 blocks deep, something like that. It's probabilistic. You want to make sure that you match your requirement for how deep it's buried in the blockchain according to how important and sizable the transaction is and what your measures are for reducing your risk during the final closing of that transaction. So it's more complex than what people generally say, and it's probabilistic. There is no concern for me. I just think there's basically a certainty that there's going to be insane demand for layer 1 block space in the coming decades. I think that there is almost no consumer or business demand to spend Bitcoin today because everybody expects the purchasing power of Bitcoin to rise dramatically in the coming years. So I don't expect medium of exchange to take off in any meaningful sense until the 2030s.
But one thing is, wouldn't the fees be quite high then in order to be able to get into, if you're saying layer 1 activity is going to be high and block space is limited, then I think certain lower, level transactions will be priced out basically, and only kind of huge.
That's right. Yeah, this is what these promoters of the security budget problem always twist themselves into a pretzel, because basically every other week they switch from saying fees are too high to fees are too low, fees are too high, fees are too low. And really they're just trying to figure out some way to market something related to Bitcoin, some kind of pump and dump scam usually.
But maybe you didn't understand what I was saying, because what I'm saying is like certain transactions below a price point are going to be priced out, and only the largest. So you don't view that as a problem?
So you're talking about now. I was talking about like in the future, like when people try to spend Bitcoin much more, that's going to drive. And so what we're doing right now, because they're stressing the network by taking up the, rising transaction fees, sort of, let's call it temporarily and artificially, by storing JPEGs on the blockchain, that's forcing a lot of innovation very quickly on scaling, right? So ARC is off and running, and maybe they'll get something in market in 3 years or something. Lightning companies are all developing faster than they would and attracting more investment. Liquid blocks are nearing being full for the first time ever. out of Blockstream. So I think there's a lot of innovation going, trying to figure out how to essentially just batch more transactions into a single on-chain transaction to lower down that cost. So in that respect, like I don't really mind it. Again, I don't mind the agitation. I totally understand why some Bitcoin businesses that rely on low transaction costs are annoyed and they're fighting for it. And I get that. But it's not really a problem for us, even though we've had free withdrawals forever since inception, and we always will, because we have enough volume that we can still do a withdrawal really quickly, even batching 50 or 100 transactions or withdrawals into a single transaction. So that's how we basically chop that cost up across all the people that are withdrawing over the next hour or 2 hours or something like that. And that's how we handle it. But, maybe a smaller business that's trying to provide some kind of off-ramp and let their consumers do that, and they're facing a $24 charge and they have to pass that along. And, somebody was buying a $15 sandwich or something, like that's not going to work. So I get it. They're frustrated and their model is broken, and it sucks for scaling, because if you haven't already hit scale, like some businesses have scale and can handle this, the crypto exchanges or whoever can afford Lightspark or someone like us that's already large enough, like we're okay. Lots of people around the world, you see how frustrated and how unable all of these businesses in developing countries, they're just unable to onboard people onto Bitcoin right now, because it's such a bad product when the transaction fees are so high. Like, how do you even rationalize, hey, use this instead of cash or use this instead of whatever? It just muddies the argument and makes it impossible to onboard those people without using a centralized service. So in that respect, I just think it's going to cause a spike in innovation, which I welcome. And I also think that it will dwindle down and right size itself once the fast money boys have washed out.
Okay. But just at one point in there, it did sound like you were saying the future was going to be people interacting with centralized services to access layer one, because
that's what they're doing right now. So that's the worst case scenario is you just take all the rails that we have right now. Michael Saylor talks about it as the last mile, and you just sub Bitcoin in for yen, yuan, euro, dollar, right? And it's just Bitcoin and sats instead of those things, and you can just use the same rails you have now. What I think will happen though is that you already have seen this explosion in attempts to scale self-sovereign usage of Bitcoin, both from a custody perspective and from a transaction perspective. And I think that will just continue to accelerate. It was going to anyway without the ordinal stress. So these problems were going to start being very real in like 2027, 2028. I don't think it was going to be this bull run that caused enough of a mass of people to have over 90% of their liquid net worth in Bitcoin and thus have to start spending Bitcoin in the numbers that require venture capital investment to fund a huge batch of companies to go and attack that problem. I still think it's probably going to be too early. I've actually placed bets on a bunch of Lightning companies and gotten involved in ARK and things like that in case I'm wrong. I put it at about 2% that I'm wrong and that it happens before then. So I spend most of my time at Swan focused on store of value, but in case medium of exchange at scale happens before I think it does, at least I'll have a little upside in some of these other companies. But really my expectation is that it won't even be, it's not 2024, it's not 2028, it's more like 2032, that enough people will have ridden Bitcoin up enough that they demand products and services to be able to spend their Bitcoin at the scale that makes it interesting for venture capital. And so that's what I think makes it interesting for investors to build those products, to fund that development. Because otherwise you're just talking about hobbyists and it's really hard to scale things without a lot of capital. That's my framework, and I'm happy to adjust if it happens faster. And that is why it actually is kind of interesting to watch, because this is like a little trial run of what it was already going to look like in 2028 or 2032. And we get to see it in like 2023, 24 and put that stress on it. So it's earlier than the people that have to overcome that. It's before they want to deal with it. And the medium of exchange industry in Bitcoin is not as developed as it needed to be able to handle this. They don't have the tools and they haven't built it. but this is actually pulling capital into them to actually make it happen faster. So we may actually be in a better position to handle the blocks being full at the end of the decade from monetary transactions instead of JPEGs, because we have JPEG pump and dumps today.